Good to see you too.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening for those who are in the East Coast, perhaps, and good afternoon for those on the West. Some people are probably from the other side of the world. And welcome. My name is Bethel Webb, and I serve as the communications director here at CPI. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. I hope this time works better for most people. I know some people couldn't make it when it was during the day, but so this webinar is this series of webinars. We hope that will provide valuable opportunities to learn from leading experts in the field of Christian psychology. And today we are hearing from Dr. Eric L. Johnson, a distinguished figure in this field, of course, and he will be sharing his insights on the topic, a Christian diagnostic approach to the treatment of anxiety. So big words there, but I'm sure you're all familiar with those terms. So please note that there will be a question and answer near the end of the presentation. So we kindly ask that you hold your questions until then. So maybe you can like write it so you won't forget your question before then. Okay. But before we begin, I'd like to share some exciting news. So this is something that we've been working on for quite some time now, but CPI has developed a Christ-centered therapy credential. And we are thrilled to introduce step one of this program with the first intensive scheduled for March 7, which will start at March 7, and it will be consecutive Fridays until April 11 from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. So it's a whole day. I know it's a lot, but and this would be Eastern time. So this intensive is designed for licensed mental health professionals. However, if you are not licensed but have a combination of education, training experience, and clinical skills that equips you for advanced training, you may apply for an evaluation. And then we will try to respond to applications within the week. And upon approval, you may proceed uh, to register. And again, this is this intensive leads to a level 1 certification in Christ-centered therapy. And this will officially launch this year. We're hoping that we can launch very, very soon, but this is the first installment towards that. So you can find the full summary of our program on our website, Christian Psychology Institute .org. And yes, so that's on our website. The original cost of this is $1,000, but we're running early bird rates right now, which the first early bird rate is ending actually tomorrow, which would be 800, and then register by February 1st, and that would be $900. I know that was a lot of information, but just remember that we do have this Christian therapy certification, Christ-centered therapy certification coming up, and this intensive will begin on March 7, and this will lead to that. So it's the first installment towards that. Okay, so without further ado, I will pass on the floor to Dr. Johnson. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Bethel, for that. It's such a pleasure to work with you. And it's also a pleasure to see some familiar faces and some folks that I don't recognize. But just welcome to all of you. It's really a thrill for me to be in this role at this stage of my life. And tonight we're going to be looking at something that's a little dense. It's a little more academic than some of the things that we've looked at since we got launched in the fall. But what I'd like to do is go through with you a PowerPoint that I presented. So let me set that up. There we go. So I've changed the title a few times. That might have been reflected in Bethel's remarks. She hasn't seen the latest version of this, but I'm expanding it to kind of maybe I could say the traditional approach of transdiagnostic therapy to emotional disorders. And I'll explain what I'm talking about in a minute. I wonder how many of you are familiar with the notion of a transdiagnostic approach. I'm sure some of you are, those of you that are teaching in the field. But it's a relatively newer approach that doesn't really change therapy quite so much, the therapy that has taken this stance, but it's really a way of thinking about what is it that we're working with in therapy that's quite a substantial shift in focus. And I think it's quite exciting, quite important. And I think Christians ought to be involved in it. So this is why I thought this would be a topic worthy of our focus. Let me just ask, what's been the dominant approach to psychopathology over the past 140 years? Now, there's 5 or 10 different answers that would be correct, but I really would like to get some suggestions. What would you give as the label for the dominant approach to psychopathology? Maybe some of the faculty among us might give us a stab at it.
So categorical DSM-5, biopsychosocial type of model.
Yeah, that would be an appropriate way of describing what it is that we're talking about. Anybody else kind of want to offer additional? I'm going to have a couple of slides on this, so there's a few things that we can say.
I think some folks may be putting some comments in the comments too, or the chat box.
Oh yeah, that's right. Please use comments, and Bethel can negotiate that as needed.
Yeah, Dr. Mars said the same DSM.
Yeah, same thing.
Yeah. That would be the kind of the standard way of thinking about it. And back behind the DSM, I'm gonna say the medical model would be the dominant approach to psychopathology that led to the DSM, which I'll talk about in a minute. Why has the medical model been so dominant over this time period, and I guess particularly at the beginning of what we consider maybe the founding of modern psychiatry and psychology? I think the obvious answer is that the folks that were working on this at the beginning of the modern era were psychiatrists, medical doctors that were focusing on psychological problems or psychiatric problems, they might call them. I'm a psychologist, so most counselors refer to them as psychological problems. As a result, psychological disorders themselves were interpreted kind of as if they were bodily diseases. Not that they were, not that psychiatrists thought they were, but they were kind of treated as if they were. I think from a medical model standpoint, they were placed in a single discrete category, as Fernando mentioned, and given a label for that category. Sometimes, when we think about diseases, we think of them as caused by a single pathogen. And they're identified by a common set of observable symptoms. But of course, part of the challenge in psychiatry and in the field of psychopathology is things are different in matters of the soul. So what I want to do, this is the Christian Psychology Institute. What that means is, I think the stance of Christian psychology is we're fundamentally appreciative of all good in the field of psychiatry and psychology. But we're also fundamentally critical to the degree that the kind of dominant paradigms deviate from what we think a Christian perspective would yield. And so I'm going to be fundamentally appreciative tonight regarding this kind of newer approach. But along the way, I want to make a justification for why the transdiagnostic model is warranted. And that's going to mean raising some questions, some serious questions about the field of psychopathology and its roots in psychiatry. That even non-Christians in the field, secularists in the field, would have voiced. And you know, I'm not going to say anything novel tonight, but I do think it's important to think about where Christians are, you know, kind of in these debates, and kind of where our leanings would be, how we interpret things as well. So all that to say, you know, I think we want to suggest that a medical approach to psychopathology has been helpful, as is already been suggested. It's led to the ongoing development of the DSM and the ICD, which is more the European model. And these are two remarkable classification systems that are sometimes called nosological, because that's kind of the heritage back in the disease kind of medical model. Disease classification is called nosology. Well, what specifically is good about this approach? It's led to precise description of disorders and the testing of drugs and other treatments. You can do that rather easily if you have a clear-cut set of criteria for establishing who's in a group and who's out of a group. And it's made diagnosis easier to do and more uniform, given all the different people that are involved in that project. That's quite an accomplishment. And it continues to serve many as what we might call an algorithm for when medication might help with the treatment of symptoms. And all of these have a good that I think Christians can appreciate. But interestingly, in addition, the research that's been done that kind of has flowed out of the DSM has led to the identifying of neurobiological mechanisms and psychological processes that are common to disorders that are classified as different. And that's been a major discovery in the last 30 years. The fact that there are neurobiological mechanisms and psychological processes that are common to different disorders that have been categorized, you know, as being different, you know. That's quite striking. So this is really the backdrop, the research backdrop that's led to the transdiagnostic approach to psychopathology. Maybe that would be good to stop for a moment. Are there any comments or questions so far?
I think you're being kind to the DSM, and I appreciate that. I do not like the DSM categorical system for a lot of reasons. So, for example, PTSD, when they changed the criteria for the 5th edition, it's now such a broad thing. You know, a person with a car accident who has some symptoms is the same as a person with complex PTSD in terms of that category. They make things so broad sometimes to capture things. Autism spectrum disorders as well. So I really like where you're going in terms of the transdiagnostic, because there are common processes underlying these things that look very different, and we keep creating categories or broadening categories to which they create these broad things that really are not very precise at all, or there's too many categories, which is kind of ridiculous to me. But that's my personal bias, so I just want to get that out there.
Fernando.
Perhaps it's just a therapeutic moment here for me to just kind of get that out
thank
there.
You so much.
I mean, you know,
that's the thing. You know, it occurs to me tonight, you know, we could have a series of talks just on the DSM, right? And have different proponents and maybe some critics, and you know, it would be a fascinating conversation. I've never seen a Christian conference on that subject, but I think that would be really warranted and worthy of of our attention. And thank you for illustrating. We're only scratching the surface on some of the criticisms of the DSM. What I'm wanting to do is, in a very broad brush kind of way, say from this kind of very, maybe 30,000 foot standpoint, it's fundamentally a good thing. Now we're going to move on and focus on one of the problems without going into all of them. But we could, and someday we should. I think maybe that's a calling that the Christian Psychology Institute ought to take seriously. I think going even much further than we're going to go tonight. I think we have a whole set of disorders that are not even addressed in the DSM or the ICD. So, what we might call ethical or spiritual disorders that are worthy of our attention and understanding from a standpoint of what's wrong with us as human beings, right? The Christian community has a lot to contribute to the discussion of psychopathology. So thank you for bringing our attention to that. And I think we'll have to do that sometime. Well, let me then go a little bit further in this one direction of how the medical approach can be problematic. I think, one of the fundamental issues for me and has been since I was in grad school, being taught by a humanistic psychodynamic professor who raised some questions I'd never heard of before. But psychological disorders are obviously not biological diseases. They're human disorders, and that requires a holistic approach for us to understand them. And there are ways in which the DSM works the exact opposite direction. Rather than viewing us as whole persons that are disordered in various ways, it treats us as organisms that have a certain classified condition that needs treatment. And it makes it moves us away from a holistic perspective on the human being. And that, from a Christian standpoint, that's a serious liability. I can go, a little bit further. Human disorders don't have a simple, direct material cause. In fact, cases with similar symptoms like schizophrenia may actually have different causal pathways involving completely different biological and social factors, but leading to the same symptom cluster that we label with a particular label like schizophrenia. And we have to say, and I think this is where Fernando was leading us, therapy based on a faulty diagnostic system may not be as effective as it could be. I'm being quite, trying to be as fair and kind as possible, but there's a lot that could be said after that statement. So by contrast, a Christian worldview approach to psychopathology is holistic and multidimensional. We don't reduce people just all to biological, biopsychosocial organisms, but we see us as, yes, embodied, but also ethical and spiritual, as well as having psychological features. It accepts that humans are therefore subject to damaging biological and social influences. That's why we can appreciate the DSM and its merit. But we assume that humans are made in God's image and therefore called by God to become personal agents in communion or in love with one another. And this is just one way of putting it. There's, a dozen different ways of putting this point. But from a Christian standpoint, we're fundamentally sustained by glory. Another way of putting it is by meaningfulness. We live for meaning. As adults, it's very clear cut. And in childhood, we're moving towards becoming flourishing adults. And we need meaning to live, to thrive. In childhood, glory and meaning is communicated primarily through love, parental love and guidance. That's how we internalize more glory, more meaningfulness. And without sufficient love and guidance, children suffer. And if the suffering is severe enough, it causes damage, which we kind of give the broad label of psychopathology. And let me just take one step further and then I'll move on. We call severe suffering like that causes damage trauma. And, one way of thinking about it, I think this is a holistic way of thinking about trauma, which is, of course, so important today in the field of counseling. Trauma often fuels meaninglessness in adulthood. If you think about it, for lots of reasons that we won't go into tonight, I'm just trying to paint a very big picture of a Christian approach to psychology in a few broad strokes. But even something as fundamental as trauma is related to meaninglessness, to the lack of meaning that we have if we're not properly nurtured in a meaningful world, and cared for according to God's design plan. Well, that's a little bit perhaps off topic, but as we talk about this transdiagnostic approach, I want you to feel with me the tension that I always feel when I'm reading and appreciating, appropriating secular material, material from a secular worldview, written by secular folks, studied by secular folks. There's always a tension. There is the common grace there that we're trying to discern and draw out and properly interpret by translating it and bringing it into a Christian worldview. But there has to be also some place for a critique and asking deep questions that in grad school people don't have time to ask because we're too busy studying and trying to learn for the next test. But we do need to spend time doing that. It's the advantage of a Christian program. And it's the kind of work that we'll be doing for the rest of our lives as we find a new model, like the transdiagnostic model, and then think through how is this different from what I've seen before? How is it better? Maybe how is it worse? But even so, how would a Christian approach to this appropriate it critically and constructively? All right, done for that part. What's a transdiagnostic approach then? In contrast to studies of therapy that focus on single disorders, like how do you treat a panic attack, or classes of disorders, like how do you treat anxiety across the different anxiety disorders, a transdiagnostic approach seeks to treat maladaptive psychological processes that are common to different disorders. Such processes can be measured in non-clinical and clinical samples. We can find people who are doing quite well with these processes and others that are really struggling with them, that seem to have a lack or absence of well-developed processes. And also they can be found across disorders. They don't just characterize a single disorder, but multiple disorders. Studies of clinical populations have found somewhere between, depending on the study, 40 to almost 100% comorbidity of major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. What does that mean? Comorbidity may not be familiar to all of us, but it simply means that these disorders overlap in clinical populations that have major depressive disorder. They often, people with major depressive disorder often have generalized anxiety disorder and vice versa. And this is clinical populations, but that's still remarkable. That's striking. What would explain that overlap? Some, therefore, more over the last 30 years, people have begun suggesting that there's an underlying set of conditions that account for this overlap, and they've termed this set negative affect syndrome. Again, it's still a medical model. That's just what we're going to get, from this approach, but there's still a lot we can learn. The conditions that they kind of have settled on is a generalized biological vulnerability, pretty much meaning genetic influence on things like personality dispositions from birth. For example, a tendency towards anxiety, towards emotional lability, easily changeableness in infancy. These things can be detected, and behavioral inhibition. Just being a little shy, withdrawn, within 3 months, that tendency, for example, can be identified, and that's a result of some genetic predisposition. Also, this negative affect syndrome is associated with generalized psychological vulnerability to cues in the environment that cause them to be triggered into an dysregulation, emotional dysregulation. For example, the lack of an expectation in adulthood that others care about me. And so therefore, when somebody acts in a certain way, it may trigger that sense that, yeah, once again, this person doesn't care for me. And that this is not so much related to genetics as it is experiences in childhood, though of course there's an overlap, right? And then it's this negative affect syndrome is also associated with a specific psychological vulnerability related to a perception of threat or danger. And this too is a result of early childhood experiences where we become primed to notice things that are indicators of someone who could be dangerous. People who grow up in dysfunctional families become pretty skilled at identifying someone who could get angry rather easily, and so that then is considered a specific psychological vulnerability. So it's led to this this kind of conglomeration. It's not that many disorders that we're going to look at, but that are under this umbrella. But it's an umbrella that is larger than we would say the mood disorders or anxiety disorders. And therefore, it would seem to be a good candidate for I should have said a transdiagnostic approach. Transdisciplinary is another term I use in other contexts, but that's a typo. So the maladaptive psychological processes that characterize this include emotion-driven behavior. For example, the behaviors that help us to avoid the activation of negative emotion. We may stay away from certain social contexts because we've experienced the negative emotions or distress getting activated in them. And so we develop a whole behavioral repertoire that keeps us feeling safe. And then also poor emotion regulation skills. Consequently, measurable treatment goals for this broader category of negative affect syndrome would be reduction in emotion avoidance, helping people to kind of challenge themselves to go into places that they have a tendency not to. And then the development of emotion regulation skills. And with the long-term goal is kind of common sense, but a reduction in negative emotion and an increase in positive emotion overall. Now that's a pretty lofty goal, and as therapists, we're kind of aware that goal doesn't necessarily materialize certainly in a week, in 10 to 12 weeks of therapy, which is or 18, let's say. But nonetheless, it is certainly the long-term goal, and it's a worthy goal for sure. So transdiagnostic models are becoming an evidence-based treatment for negative affect syndrome, and I have a lot of information on that. This is being recorded, of course, and you will have access. All of you will have access to it, as well as other folks that will get this afterwards. But so I'm not going to go through this. I don't think it's necessary. I just want you to know that there's been substantial research, dozens, if not at this point, probably over 100 studies that have been done on this approach. It's relatively newer, but the folks that are doing this research are really excellent. And there's no doubt that this is going to be a dominant approach in the future. One of the leading researchers in the transdiagnostic approach is a fellow named David Barlow, and he has coined the term a unified protocol for his treatment program for how to address negative affect syndrome. He is, I bet many of you are familiar with him, and I'm not going to go into super detail about this, but I want to give us enough of a feel for what it is that Barlow and his research team has come up with over the last 20 years for us to at least know what it is that the unified protocol is trying to do. It takes about 12 to 18 sessions, which are set up in a kind of a educational sequence so that later sessions are building on earlier sessions, and it includes homework. David Barlow is a well-known cognitive behavioral therapy researcher, And he's not doing anything novel in that sense. It's not, I wouldn't call it a model of therapy, this unified protocol. It's a protocol, right? He's not calling it a model, but rather it's a way of thinking about the problem that cognitive behavior therapy is trying to address. And he's certainly been influenced by second wave CBT as well as third wave CBT in what he's trying to do. But that's not really that salient unless you're really familiar with those approaches. As I've already implied, the treatment seeks to change the counselee's core biopsychosocial mechanisms that are common to anxiety and mood disorders. I just want to very quickly mention a few Christian worldview reservations already. And, I may be overdoing it here, but this is the way that I think we need to read and digest and end up translating these approaches as we take in the good, but then we think about it. We reflect, yeah, but how is that different from the way that Christians think, or at least, we ought to think according to leading Christian thinkers in our day, theologians, philosophers that wrestle with this kind of stuff. Well, one of the ways is that it assumes a mechanistic paradigm. CBT in general, I don't want to say across the board, not everyone who is a cognitive behavioral therapist would subscribe to a mechanistic worldview, but that's what CBT is about. It very much comes out of the medical model, and it's embraced by majority of hospital treatment programs. I'm not saying the unified protocol, but I'm talking about CBT in general. And that's because it fits a medical model. I'm not saying anything really controversial, although I want to always acknowledge that there are exceptions to the rule. But I think it's so important for us as Christians to never stop reminding ourselves, because we're bombarded with a mechanistic approach in the literature all the time. But humans are living beings, and even living organisms are not just machines. They're alive. They have a body and a soul. Living organisms do. And from a human standpoint, our body and soul forms a unified, interdependent life that is unreducible to a machine-like thing, and it transcends even all other organisms in terms of its complexity. But more than that, because we're made for meaning, and that can't be captured by a mechanistic approach. And in fact, if you get into the literature very much, you see that they don't focus on meaning. That's not what's driving them. They're certainly not going to focus on glory. I think this is important for me to pause in my discussion about this approach, because the reason why I'm interested in this approach is because they take emotion seriously. And I pay attention to any therapeutic model that takes emotion seriously. Why? Because from a Christian worldview standpoint, emotions are signs of the meaning of one's story. They're not just mechanisms, neurological mechanisms that get triggered by an environmental cue. I mean, that's certainly part of it, but it's so reductionistic. It can hardly capture how we experience emotions as humans and as Christians. And I think this is therapeutically much richer, much more valuable than what the unified protocol ends up giving us. It gives us some good stuff, but it doesn't take us to as far as we need to go. Chronic negative emotions in adulthood are signs of suffering that have been experienced before one could process them in childhood and adolescence, before we had the adult capabilities that many adults have, but many adults don't have, because they weren't properly scaffolded into the development of such emotion regulation skills. And as a result of that, negative emotions got cumulatively internalized, so that we enter adulthood with a strong disposition towards negative affect, perhaps, getting labeled as major depression or chronic anxiety, and perhaps getting labeled as generalized anxiety disorder or panic attack, OCD or whatever. But all of them have this common root. And having a lot of anxiety that gets manifested with different symptoms, but still has this core sense of danger. Anxiety is a sign that I'm experiencing, I could be in danger, or something got triggered where I feel like I'm in the presence of danger. And, chronic sadness is having a lot of loss in one's life. One's story isn't the way it was supposed to be according to God's original design plan for flourishing human life. And because we didn't have that, we grow up sad. And I hope you have a little sense here. We don't have time to go into much detail, but how beneficial it is to, when we're working with people, to see them, their signs are not a problem to be eliminated. I don't even like the term negative affect syndrome. That's a horrible label. Even I'm being very critical now. So much for my neutrality. But negative affect syndrome, it's like, what's wrong with you? You have a syndrome that's, you have this too much negative affect. Well, yeah, it's too much. It's overwhelming. And because we love people, we want to help them. We want to relieve it. But it's not like they're coming to us with some syndrome. Their story has been compellingly overloaded with trauma. And we want to be with them in a way that connects with them. And I think a Christian worldview is going to be much more valuable in therapy than a more mechanistic one. So let me just finish on this, and then we'll move on. The more disruptive one's negative emotions are now in adulthood, let's say, the greater it's just like, this is a rule of life. The greater was one's suffering and exposure to fallenness in childhood. People who are overwhelmed with sadness and overwhelmed with anxiety were exposed to an unfair amount of fallenness in life. And I think God knows what I'm talking about. I know when I say unfair, that might sound like an indictment to him. I don't mean it as such. I love him very, very much. But I also want to be honest with the world within which we live. And I don't think he wants us to beat around the bush about reality. He died for reality. So I don't think he's into us pretending that things are better than they are. So I think we help people when we're this honest. It helps us to be better therapists and better able to connect with those that we work with. Okay, well, let me move on. We'll be done with the PowerPoint, around the top of the hour, and then we'll have a half hour for a little exercise that I'd like to do, and some Q&A. Well, I'm not going to discuss all the modules either, because there are 8 modules in the Unified Protocol that Barlow and his colleagues came up with. But the first 2 are self-explanatory, really. The first session is kind of, helping to do some motivational interview, kind of helping to encourage the person. This is going to work and you're going to love it. That's a little over the top, but that's kind of the gist of the first session. We're, getting to know the person and then directing them to this will be helpful. And then the next few sessions, or a couple sessions, are directed to psychoeducation, understanding the kind of struggles that human beings have that are the goal of the Unified Protocol for emotional disorders, and training, kind of an initial training of how to identify and track through the week between sessions my emotional experience. So there's checklists and various forms to go through to help people begin to develop an awareness of the ebb and flow of their emotional experience during the week. But the heart of the therapy is the following weeks, where first training them in emotional awareness without judgment. And of course, those that, if you've been in the field for very long, when you see that phrase, non-judgmental, present-focused awareness of a negative emotion, can I get someone to say the label of what that's about?
Mindfulness.
Thank you. We should have all said it together. 1, 2, 3. But yeah, mindfulness. So he's familiar with this. Is a very helpful strategy. It's helping people to become aware of their emotion and to stay with them, like so that their emotions are still on, but without adding the inner critic to it and allowing the inner critic to run free reign. I mean, that's one way of putting what happens with kind of standard mindfulness. A second major therapy strategy is cognitive appraisal and then reappraisal, becoming aware of the kind of self-talk, the running dialogue that we have that is consonant with the negative emotion. You're so stupid. You can't do anything right, whatever. And this is standard CBT, second wave for that matter. Identifying beliefs that support the negative emotion, reinforce it, and at the same time, in this appraisal, stopping and saying, wait a minute, I don't have to believe that. I have an option not to believe it. However, in keeping with the kind of third wave, the suggestion of, in the therapy is the goal is rather than arguing with yourself, which we might say a simplistic sort of second wave CBT would recommend, or RET, you need to be logical and argue with those negative emotions, negative beliefs, or at least the negative beliefs. The goal is to develop cognitive flexibility so that you can kind of roll with what it is that you're thinking and not jump on yourself. That's what they're trying to eliminate, to slow down the automatic thought process and to help people kind of hang with what's going on and see if we can develop a different evaluation of the beliefs and a different set of beliefs that would be healthier. That's really the trajectory of that step. The third step, really, it's not modules I'm talking about, but the third real therapy step is to recognize when emotion avoidance has been activated and when I'm actually being motivated by emotion in what I'm doing and what I'm deciding to do, where I'm going, where I'm not going, who I'm talking to and who I'm not talking to, the job promotion I'm avoiding, or whatever. And there are a number of different sorts of focuses in this phase. This is really a key one, I think, for most of us who struggle with anxiety. Behaviors that I avoid, also thoughts that I don't want to think. And becoming aware of how I actually, somebody brings up something and I don't want to go there, so I tell them, we're not going to talk about that. And that's a kind of cognitive avoidance as well as a behavior avoidance. The search for safety signals and identifying those and how to get out of danger. And then also how to avoid physical sensations that are not pleasant, that are cues that I could be going into a dangerous situation. All of these are kind of standard for those of us that struggle with anxiety or depression. Fourthly, becoming aware, and this is where it really starts to get into the therapy. So far, it's been mostly recognition and not so much intervention, but becoming aware of physical sensations, becoming cued to my body. This has become such a big area of therapy focus since I started in the field, when nobody talked about the body. And there's different ways of talking about it. Mindfulness is certainly one. Doing the hard thing rather than the easier thing, pushing through. I don't think that's a helpful way of thinking about it, but some cognitive behavioral therapists, to my ears, sound like they just say you need to push through it and then reward yourself and kind of just kind of force yourself to learn how to tolerate unpleasant physical sensations. And then the fifth and final approach to the modules of the unified protocol, steps in the unified protocol, therapy steps, would be becoming skilled in interoceptive awareness and exposing myself to it while I'm doing other soothing and calming and stress reducing activities. that allow me to experience the emotion without becoming overwhelmed. And I can do that internally. Interoception is the awareness that I have of what's going on in my body. So I can do that internally alone. But I can also put myself in situations where I am going to be activated. So this can be done in session, and it can be done imaginatively in session or at home in homework. And then also homework can involve in vivo exposure and just encouraging yourself to go into places that are more challenging. And then the last module is focusing on what to do if you get overwhelmed and you're no longer seeing a therapist. What are some strategies to kind of help you get back on track and kind of remind yourself of the things that you learned previously? All right. Well, there's so much to talk about and think about. There's so much content. We'll have some time, but I want to begin a Christian reflection on it. And of course, wanting to look at the positive contributions that as Christians, I think we can really appreciate and celebrate in the model. And then we'll look at some things that are a little bit more critically, I think. Emotion awareness training. This is great. We all therapists are supposed to be, I think, need to be, I should say, emotionally aware, both of themselves and those with whom they are working, of course. And that's because, from a Christian standpoint, it's not a we don't have as much a mechanistic reason for it. Is because emotions are so valuable. They help us to get to know people. Emotions direct us to a person's core of their being, their heart. And by attending to them, we value them. We tell them, you're important to me. I'm so interested in how you feel and how you have felt and how you felt when that happened. Tell me more. You see, a holistic approach values emotions because it brings us to the heart of the person. Mindfulness is lonely. I'm not going to go off on mindfulness. Christians can redeem that term. I know that there are people in this room that have done so. But I would just say, in general, it derives from a Buddhist model of therapy, and Buddhism is a lonely religion. I mean, it's beneficial, it can do good things, at least in this life, but I think it has some weaknesses, some limitations that as Christians we ought to talk more about than it seems to me in the Christian community, Christian therapy community we have done. And one of the most obvious from a Christian standpoint is just plain lonely. You just do everything by yourself. Even the third wave therapists, when you see what they do, they don't even necessarily, it's not even relational. That's one of the deficits of the protocol, a unified protocol. There's nothing in there beyond the kind of paying lip service to, yeah, you need to form a therapeutic bond, which of course everybody says nowadays. But it's pretty much driven by the changing the strategies inside the person. Now, I'm being too negative right here. I'm wanting to be more positive, but I'm just wanting to concede that I don't think mindfulness goes far enough for us because we have much richer relational resources that we want to use and build upon. We can deal with emotions relationally, certainly in therapy, of course, we can do so relationally, and also in imaginative meditation. However, I'm being positive about this. Sorry, it wasn't quite obvious there. But another thing that I like about the unified protocol is it's focused on emotion avoidance and emotion-driven behaviors. This was a big issue in my own life for many years. I wasn't aware of what I was doing and ways that I function with people. It occurs to me right now, one of the best things about church and why God designed us for church and kind of, has that as a part of new covenant life is because church is going to activate a lot of the triggers that we have as human beings growing up in a fallen world. And it creates, ideally, this is the ideal. And I know a lot of churches aren't there yet, but this is God's goal, is that churches are safe places for us to go and kind of experiment, kind of challenge ourselves. Maybe, rather than running out of the church building, what if I stayed for a minute and looked around and see if I catch someone's eye and I spend a moment with them? That's undermining emotion avoidance and emotion-driven behaviors. And you can do that every week in church. Try to do that, most weeks. And why is this important? Because when I say emotions are meaningful signs, it doesn't mean that we want to you know increase negative emotion. I never have said that. I don't mean that. We value any emotional experience because it's a pathway into the heart. But negative emotions are a sign of a person's exposure to fallenness. So we don't want people to live there. We want to, Christ is all about redemption out of our fallenness as much as possible in this life and completely in the life to come. So, this is a clear reason why we like that particular module. Also, awareness and tolerance of embodied experience, not just physical sensations. I think we need to talk about our bodies as being, this rich God-given source of wisdom. And our bodies are so loaded with cues that God is communicating to us through our bodies with. So yeah, that's great. We need to become more aware. Our bodies are alive. They're meaningful. They're constantly communicating meaning to us. However, contrary to second wave CBT, we don't argue with our bodies, and we don't argue with our clients, trying to convince them of the logic of it all, of the logic of redemption. Truth, of course, we need truth, but the question in Christian therapy is, how do we help people, receive the truth when they're primed to avoid it? That's the challenge of Christian therapy. So this is familiar to us, I'm sure, but being curious, looking for the meaning wherever it might be, and then after we process the emotion, we want to surrender it and let it go and replace it perhaps with a redemptive emotion, or at the very least mix up redemptive emotions with our emotions of fallenness, negative emotions. Anyway, we don't have time to go into all of that kind of stuff, but that's just sort of the theoretical model behind the kind of assessment of why we like this model. Well, I like it, and I hope you do too, but also things that we're critical of. And then lastly, it's just paying attention to our bodies and challenging ourselves by doing something new that's going to activate me and give me an opportunity to work with Jesus again, or with my therapist, or with myself, in processing my experiences of fallenness, my present experience of fallenness. That's just great. So there are real valuable elements of the unified protocol that I think ought to be a part of Christian therapy in general. But what are some negatives of this approach? We can have the same goals of helping people to relieve people of their of the overwhelming negative experiences that they're having in life. But we do so with a lot of good theology. And I'm not going to have time to go into this, but I just point you in that direction. Um, you know, we've had some other webinars where we've talked about this. A lot of our work is going to be theologically based, and that's what makes Christian psychology different than a lot of other Christian approaches out there, I think. But so I just want to not just make a passing reference, but this is really deep and important, but we don't have time to go into it today. But I'm going to end up instead on the relational triangle, which some of you are familiar with Christian psychology. I'm talking about a God at the top, and then the counselee and the counselor. This is relational triangle is so foundational to a Christian approach and to the Trinity. The Trinity is the founder of this triangle. But the relational triangle is so important in Christian therapy. And in this way, this is something that's really not very much addressed in most CBT, and certainly isn't in the unified protocol. But for us, it's really foundational. It really distinguishes our model, at least from CBT, and in some ways the other models too, I think. But and that's because we do place a very high emphasis on empathic communion with the therapist. Our facial expression is so important, our interest, our curiosity in the other, asking good questions that shows we're interested and we want more information. And then our fundamental posture of validation and affirmation. That's just empathic communion with us, as the therapist. And that's so foundational. That's just a part of the relational triangle that is foundational to Christ-centered therapy. And then lastly, and this is where we're going to go next, is empathic communion with Jesus. And how do we do that? Well, I'm going to list the 4 major ways that we can facilitate communion with Jesus with our counselees to foster the resolution of negative emotion experiences. One of them being Lectio Divina, opening up our heart to God through spiritual reading, and then relating our emotional experience to what was read. There's a lot of different ways to read the Bible that are beneficial, and we can read it with different purposes in mind. Bible study is one of them. It's very good to do it that way. But Lectio Divina is different from Bible study, and it's where we come receiving from the passage, looking to hear from God in the passage in a way that's different from trying to gain knowledge or information from the passage. And so Bible study isn't directly related to Christian therapy. It's indirectly foundational to it, very foundational. But therapeutically, Bible study is not helpful for therapy journey because we need healing, and that's a different kind of a way of processing the Bible. And I would like to do an example of that before we go. Okay. A second kind of processing in the Christian tradition is prayer, of course, and one of the most relevant, obviously, is lament. And this is such a foundational biblical guide in many places in the Bible, but especially in the book of Psalms, where we pour out our hearts to the Lord like water. In Lamentations 2:19, this is the stance of a Christian, I think, to be with God in their heart and to open up to God on a regular basis, at least daily, and I guess ideally throughout the day, really. And then, but looking for it to be dialogical, that not just that we pour out our hearts to Him, but also what does He say in response? Often that's fed by our scripture reading, maybe for the day. And then thirdly, flexible guided imagery with Jesus, addressing one's emotions and emotional experiences. And here in 1,000 different creative ways, there's just so much good that can be done using our God-given imagination. And then lastly, the fourth way that I'm just going to mention is imagine Jesus in an empty chair having a conversation with Him about an emotionally significant memory or an experience that I've had recently or one that I'm having right now. And again, there's a lot of different ways of setting that up. All right. Well, what I'd like to do then, we're at the top of the hour, but I think I can get through this pretty quickly. This is just an example of how a Christian approach, bringing Jesus in to the therapy to help a person process negative emotion experience. Not a syndrome. I won't call it a negative affective syndrome, but rather negative emotion experience that a person's having. And what I want to do here is I want to be very, very clear now. Christ-centered therapy isn't Christ-only therapy. And I've said that in previous webinars already, and I'm going to probably say it every time that I speak, because I think a lot of people misunderstand what we're trying to do in Christian therapy. And they think, oh, it's just religion. It's just religious therapy, Well, it is religious therapy, but that's not all it is. That wouldn't be therapeutically responsible. That's not being a responsible image of God. I could talk about that forever, but so I just want to underscore that if any of you who this might be your first webinar with us, bless you. I'm so glad you're here, and I just want to be very clear that what we're doing in Christ-centered therapy is He's the center of it, but we're in the room. I mean, we're an essential part of it. And there are 1,000 different things we can do, various techniques, many of them developed by non-Christians that are good techniques, good ways of helping people. So I just wanted to underscore that what I'm doing in this webinar, and what this is going to be the tendency of our webinars, right? These are going to be different than a lot of other kinds of webinars out there, is we're going to concentrate on what's different about what we're doing. Because I could repeat what you could learn at an APA or an ACA or MFT conference, but why do that? You can do that in any other conference, what I'm wanting to do is, yes, we can use all of those strategies, at least for the most part, in general, in the abstract, I want to say, yeah, we can use all those strategies. And we have these, let's call them religious strategies, where we focus on Jesus. Because it's the whole package that is what gives us such a rich and rewarding set of strategies that we can use with people to help them get healing. So, all right, done with that. Tom is a medical technician. He struggles with guilt and shame as a father and about himself in general. And there's a whole history behind a guy like Tom. Let's assume that. But today he brings up the subject of presentations that he has to make periodically at his job. And in recent months, he's felt himself more and more freezing up and barely getting through. And he gets so embarrassed that the most recent time that he's thinking about quitting his job. And this is what he comes in with on a particular day that he's talking with you, let's say. And he tells this story, and after about 15 minutes, these are some of the things that we could do from a Christ-centered standpoint. And some of these are things that any therapist would do. So we might take the next half hour to do some kind of an experience that brings Jesus into his experience. So first, we might begin by getting him into a relaxed meditative state using body relaxation and deep breathing, different ways of doing that. We could ask him then to tell us again what happened at this most recent presentation, keeping his eyes closed. And so he's in a quasi-meditative state. And then direct him, describe the feelings that are activated in your body. Tell me about them. Where are they located? We might explore that a little bit more to make sure that they're pretty vivid. The goal is to get them, that negative emotion experience, to be as vivid as possible in a different setting. There's always a little bit of challenge and a little bit of loss, sometimes a lot of loss when the person talks about it the next day or the next week. But we want to encourage them to symbolize the negative emotions that he's experiencing as vividly as possible, using visualization. Like, for example, let's say he says, yeah, I feel like there's this really thick belt that's around my chest right now, and it's super tight. I can hardly breathe. And then what I would do at that point, if I feel that it's vivid enough to be able to work with successfully or helpfully, then I'm going to stop and I'm say, I'd like to pray now. Would that be okay? And of course, we've already done the proper preparation. They know we're going to pray because we've done this before. We've talked about it before, but I'm assuming this is somebody that we've worked with before. But we can pray then and ask Jesus to enter into the setting. Now, at this point, different Christian therapists are going to do different kind of things. I'm going to assume that this is the first time that I've done something like this, what I'm about to do with him, and that this particular scenario might be a little tricky for him to go negotiate on his own, assuming the Holy Spirit is working. We just invited Jesus to enter into the setting by the Spirit. So this is what I'm going to do. And some of you might want to do it differently. That's wonderful. I go for it. But I might say to this person, imagine Jesus stopping time in that presentation where everybody's frozen, like you see in the movie sometime. And then all of a sudden he's arrived and he's talking to you and everybody else is frozen. And you have the time to talk with him. And he tells you he wants to give you his peace. So he gets right in front of you. Imagine he's right in front of you and he puts his hand on your chest. And imagine feeling the peace of Christ entering into you, passing through his arm, through his hand, into your chest. And it's a strong and a calm and a warm feeling. And you start to feel it filling up your chest more and more until it starts to fill your chest out and it swells your chest and it bursts the band. And you suddenly feel a release of the anxiety and the tension. Now, I'm going through this way too fast. I'm sorry, but I've run out of time. So you can tell I'm doing it faster than I would in an actual session. Don't do this at home. But I would certainly want to ask, so how are you feeling? I'd want to be checking in with them throughout this whole process. And at this point, I'm certainly going to say to try and gauge how much of that was meaningful to you. Did it feel like the Lord was actually there? And what was that like? Then let's just suppose Christ asks if he can unfreeze time so that you can continue your presentation. Imagine continuing your presentation, but now he will be with you. He will be standing right next to you the whole time, and now his hand will be on your back, and you know that he's rooting for you. Would you like to try that? And then give him a few minutes of silence. He and Jesus can do some stuff there. And I usually will invite that, maybe there's something Jesus wants to talk to you about. And I'll give them some moments of silence where they can go through that. And then Tom might practice that, and then we'll conclude. And then I need at least 10 minutes, ideally, at least 10 minutes. We kind of pull out of the quasi-meditative state, and then we debrief. So what was that like? What worked? What didn't work? And I get a better idea of where the person was at throughout that whole experience, and how much it felt like Jesus was there helping. All right. I think that's all I'm going to do now. Whoa, that was a little quick to pull out of that, but let me stop there. And yeah, I'd like to do a very short little exercise. Okay. And what I'd like to do is have you close your eyes, if you would be so kind. And of course, I'm going to close my eye, well, except when I'm reading. But right now my eyes are closed. I'm not looking at anybody. I'm not going to be staring at any of you, actually, this time. But I want to just say, you don't have to do anything that I'm saying. If you don't want to, please don't. But those of you that would like to join me in this very brief little reading, I just would like to just have a taste of an experiential possible encounter with the Lord through his word. This is going to be just a very quick Lectio Divina exercise. And God forgive me for the quickness of this. You're worth a lot more time than I'm demonstrating right now. But I just would invite you to take a moment to just connect with yourself, be aware is what I mean of what's going on with you. How's your day been before you sat down in this webinar? And I wonder if there's any negative emotion that you were carrying today that you're aware of. And if so, I'd just like to ask you to bring it to the surface of your awareness and focus on it for maybe 30 seconds. So I'd like to read from a really famous passage from the Gospel of Matthew. And it's in chapter 26, which is getting very close to the time when Christ is going to be crucified. In fact, it's the night before. And I just want to recite to you a familiar few sentences of our Lord Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. We'll never understand the amount of negative emotion that he experienced that evening. And even more difficult, the negative emotion he experienced on the cross when he was forsaken by the Father. But he was anticipating that, and it filled him with such negative emotion. He had some bizarre physiological reaction that was going on during part of this time. And he prayed a very short prayer 3 times. And I'm going to read it 3 times, separated by about 30 seconds. And we'll just see what the Lord might want to say with you this evening. My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And let me pray before we enter a different phase of our webinar. Oh God, we don't understand what you prayed very much, but it's surely one of the most awesome prayers ever. And it seems so deep and so rich and so unfathomable and yet so fathomable. And we pray that you would write that prayer on our hearts, because we really do love you and we want your life to be in us. And we feel that somehow that prayer is a key to our life in this world. May it be so, Lord, for your glory and for our glory. In your name, amen. All right. A little awkward to quickly transition from such an awesome passage. I concede, and I kind of feel like maybe we need more time than the bottom of the hour for those that would like to stay a little bit longer and hang with us. I think I feel obligated to offer that since I went over myself. But we have 15 minutes that have been mutually agreed upon, and I'd be happy to entertain some thoughts, some observations, or questions as anyone would like to.
Hey, Eric.
Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
I asked a question in the chat earlier. How are Barlow and Sue Johnson and her kind of her emotion-focused therapy strategies, how are they saying some similar things and how are they different from each other, if you're familiar with hers?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Did you say Sue Johnson?
Yeah, Johnson's.
Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
emotion
Yeah,
focused therapy.
yeah. I'm not as familiar with her as I am with Greenberg and others, but I'm familiar with her. So um, yeah, my sense, and correct me if I'm wrong. This is I love this group. I mean, there are names I didn't see at the beginning. I'm so glad you're all here. And some of you could correct me, and should correct me if I misstep, if I make a mistake, a misstatement. But my sense is that emotions are prized by EFT people. And going back to Carl Rogers, they prize emotions in a way that's similar to Christian therapy, at least what I think Christian therapy is. And I don't get a sense that negative emotions in particular are prized by even the third wave folks. And of course, they're a substantial improvement over second wave, where my reading of second wave is the negative emotions are illogical and we need to rid ourselves of them. Now, maybe that's an overstatement, but that's certainly what you get from RET, and I would say even Beck at his best. But might be, anyway, we'll leave that for another time. I think certainly the third wave folks are more subtle, more they're accepting. I mean, right? They're much more open to emotion experience. But I use the word prize. I think that's valid. I'm happy to be corrected. But I think emotion focused people believe that there is meaning there. It's a personal, private meaning. That's the difference between a Christian approach and a secular EFT, because it's a private meaning, but they still value it. They still see, we're meaning making creatures. I think that's a motto, almost of the movement, and so they prize it. From a Christian standpoint, I think we want to say it's meaningful to God, and therefore our emotions are really meaningful, if I can put it that way. Like, not just because they mean something to me, but because they really are meaningful. They transcend me. They're transcendently meaningful in that sense, because God values them too. And so that would maybe be three kind of differences in approach. But any other thoughts about that? Any qualifications?
No, thank you. That was good. I like how you kind of posed those. Appreciate it.
Okay. Someone else?
This might be in the same vein of that question. First of all, hey, Dr. Johnson, good to see you.
Hey,
Thank
man.
you for this.
Great to see you.
So you talked about one of the things that we might do is replace, I don't know what it was, if it was
Positive
negative.
emotion.
Yes, and replace them with maybe godly emotions, something along those lines. Could you double click on that for us? What exactly do you mean by that? What would that look like in practice?
Yeah, I thought about that as I was preparing, and I actually reversed the order for the first time. I'm in process, and still trying to figure this out. But so kind of it depends on what it is that we're focusing on, and what it is that we're doing with the person, where the person is at in their journey. And it's also complicated. It's like there's no one rule that fits all circumstances, of course. But the issues that are at stake is, what are we trying to do? One of the things that I think we're trying to do in Christian therapy is we're trying to build a new self. And that new self is grounded on created goodness that we all have. Everybody has. You don't have to be a Christian, right, to have created goodness. We all got created goodness. And that's sort of the foundational created infrastructure of every human self made in God's image. And we want to build that out. We want to elaborate that. That's why affirmation is such an important part of all therapy. But we grow up in a fallen world. We have these negative emotion experiences. And if we grow up with a lot of fallenness, we have an overwhelming amount of negative emotion experience that gets chronically reactivated throughout our day, you know. So what do we do with that? Well, one thing we can do is learn how to get out of that state and get into a positive emotion state. And that's a major accomplishment for people who grew up with too much fallenness. And I think it's a worthy and legitimate goal. And in two ways. We want to strengthen the created structures that are there, and we want to elaborate them and have people develop new created structures that they didn't get growing up, but that they can cultivate in adulthood, especially with our help and the help of others and Jesus. So one way of doing that is, okay, you had a bad experience. Let's say shame. I mean, that's an easy one, because shame is, we know it's deadly, right? Shame is deadly. It's destructive. If you hang on to shame too much, it starts breaking down your created goodness. I mean, that's how debilitating it is, especially over the long haul, as well as your body, right? So well established. However, it's also meaningful, especially, you know, the Bible talks a fair amount about shame, you know, even in the second and third chapters of the Bible. So I think we can say pretty clearly that it's nice, at the very least, it's healthy to be without shame. And so it would be nice if we can help somebody who's feeling a lot of shame and they processed it really well, and we've worked with them through it, to get out of that shame and then to feel without shame for a while, like the Lord smiling on them and saying things like, you know, I love you, you're my beloved child, you know, in whom I'm well pleased. And they bathe in that for a while. So that would be I was feeling the shame. I've let go of that. I've surrendered that. Depending on what the shame is about, maybe I might have repented of that. There's different kinds of shame, but now I'm just receiving now the gaze of God, you know, or the things that I'm saying to them. You did such a good job today, whatever, so that they can feel a relatively pure, and you know, maybe not pure, but a purer state of positive emotion. I called it redemptive emotion in the handout. So I think that's a wonderful transition, and I try and do something like that in every session. That's the goal. That would be one goal, not a requirement of a session. But I do want to then qualify that by saying, but there are some emotions where you can't do that. Depending on where the person's at in their development, they maybe can't do that. Like, so a lot of times the goal is, can we get them from a 7 to a 5? You know, man, victory, woohoo, let's celebrate. You know, they came in at a 7 or an 8, and they were pulling their hair out, and now they're down to 5. Man, that was hard work, you did so good, you know, whatever. So depending on where they're at, that might be a victory, and we'll just take it and praise hallelujah, you know. But on the other hand, you know, life is complicated, and I think part of the goal of the therapy journey is helping people, training them how to get to a place where they feel 100% safe, where they're at 0 and they're experiencing nothing but their parasympathetic system. Like, I think that's an amazing goal. But I also don't want it so complicated. Thank you, Benjamin, for asking this question, because I also don't want to say, but that's the only goal of a Christian, right? Because that's not the goal of a mature Christian. That wasn't Jesus's goal in the Garden of Gethsemane. And if we're dealing with grief, you know, of a child who's dying, we're not supposed to be all happy. That's not healthy. That's its own version of psychopathology. So emotions are so rich and so complex. You know, there isn't just one rule fits all, but, you know, there's a lot of different considerations, including developmental, in order to know, well, what's the next step this person needs that might be a nice outcome of today's session. And that, man, you know, if I can see that clearly, it's a good day.
Thank you. That's so helpful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi,
Hey there.
Eric, it's
Hi.
Darlene. Haven't
Hey,
seen you in a very
Darlene. Nice
long
to see you
time.
too.
Yeah,
Wow.
sorry, I don't know what I look like, but probably not that great. But
Oh, you're great. You're
um,
always great, Darlene. Thank you.
anyway, so I'm a little worried that this is going to give the idea that negative emotions are bad,
Mm-hmm.
because I mean, as you said, they're signs and they're good signs. We need to know if a bear is chasing us to leave to go, or that we're in danger and to act appropriately, and it gives the physiological response that we need to be able to act appropriately, that kind of thing. As you said, when somebody, we've had a loss, it's appropriate to be sad. When And even shame is appropriate if we have offended God, our neighbor, and hopefully that's going to drive us to Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who takes that shame from us.
Mm-hmm.
So I just worry that it's about just being happy, and I think that that's a huge problem in our culture right now,
Mm-hmm.
that everybody expects that if they're not happy all the time, something's wrong with them.
Thank
So,
you.
that's only, I think a lot of the interventions are pretty good. I've done mindfulness classes myself and try to make them very objective, not Buddhist, and for depression and anxiety, I've seen a lot of people be helped a great deal with those kinds of things. And I see some DBT in there, some motivational interviewing. It seems like there's a conglomerate in here. I've never heard of this before. I haven't really done a lot of training on some of these new methods. But I just want to make sure that we're not giving that message that negative emotions are bad
Yeah.
or they're sinful in some ways. And
Yep.
because it's not just our fallenness, but also the fallenness of creation, that it's not just us who have sinned, but those who have sinned against us, and just that
Absolutely.
we're messed up creation wise because of the fall as well. So I think that we need to make sure that we take a broader view of sin, not just what we do. Does that I know
That's
I'm kind of like
wonderful.
just kind
You
of
could keep talking as long as you
gurgitating.
wanted, because there isn't anything that
Because
you said that I don't 100% agree with.
okay,
It
yeah,
kind of undergirds though everything we're doing
yeah,
here, is that. And I mean, my go-to place for
exactly.
for this kind of problem is Christian radio announcers. I
Mhm.
don't, I shouldn't get started on this, but why do they have to sound like they do? There's something wrong with that the training of Christian radio announcers, because the lilt and the quasi fakiness in their voice is not fitting for Christian music. um,
Yeah,
it, it,
I
it,
don't know. I don't even go there really.
I shouldn't have gone there, forgive me.
Yeah,
But so I felt this way for such a long time. Um, so what we're trying to find is something that's so complex and nuanced and has multiple levels of complexity. It's not a simplistic be happy, but it's also not a simplistic be depressed. It's not like it's better to be depressed than happy. I don't think Christians should say that. As a general principle, it's better to be
right,
depressed than it is to be happy. I think it's better to be happy, all things being equal. God made us with, in fact, I think, as you suggested with shame, the example of shame, God created us in such a way that negative emotions are, by definition, unpleasant. And therefore, they're
right.
motivational They're emotions. They're intended to move us away from what is bad for us. But what the mistake that Stoicism made, and all Christians that follow Stoicism, is this idea that somehow the goal is therefore to be free of negative emotion and to be free of emotion in general. And there's a lot of Christian teaching that's to this day continues to confuse Stoicism and Christianity, and really does a lot of harm. As I mean, this is behind your comments, I'm sure there, but Darlene, that would, but all that to say, I'm in 100% agreement.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think we've run out of time, official time, and I just want to let you know that you're free. Bethel, do you remember if there's a time limit on the amount of the Zoom that we
No.
set apart?
Mm-mm.
Could you just there isn't, or you
No.
don't know? Okay.
There
So
is no limit.
okay, thank you. Then I would be happy to entertain another 15 minutes if any of you have it and would like to talk a little bit more about this, to unpack anything that wasn't addressed. And we'll stay no longer than a quarter to.
Just a couple of comments, Eric, for you.
Please.
Really enjoyed the presentation. A couple of thoughts. One was, it seems like when I compare Barlow's protocol with some of the resources we have as Christians, that seems like the primary emphasis is on acceptance of emotions, exposure to things, kind of getting more comfortable with things. But there's much less in terms of resolution. And I think we have more resources to generate a developmental process that can lead to resolutions. So emotions aren't bad. Emotions have a telos, and when we can connect them with the divine originator of that telos, they can resolve. And so people with anger issues can become more peaceful. They get angry less frequently, and they have more peace and joy, and other emotions come online in their life, for example. So that was one thing I observed when I kind of compared, and I think about Christian psychological things, inner healing prayer, which goes very well with, it fits under some of your categories there.
Absolutely.
Other things. So if it feels like we have more related to resolution than there. Oh gosh, there's so many other things to say. I think also one thing that's kind of missing from Barlow, and I think you touched on it, and I think that's an area that we can develop in terms of Christian psychology, is more the developmental process that people go through. So when I'm working with someone who has experientially avoided things like anger, they get anxious, and they can feel sad, and they can feel shame, and they feel guilt. But God forbid that they ever get angry at somebody. And so then they start learning how to touch that anger, and to accept that, and actually start expressing that. And but there's this developmental process that they go through as they so the process of release, I guess what I'm saying, in terms of like giving this over to God and kind of getting that transformative experience where we surrender, that can be this developmental slow process where they may be getting angry and showing irritation more for a while, and which is really scary for them, but it's actually good for them to be able to express that and learn how to bring that into relationship, and then to repent where they need to if it's
Thank
expressed
you.
inappropriately and all that.
Yes.
But there's this developmental process. Then eventually they get more comfortable with anger, and now it becomes more of a signal, and they can set boundaries without like getting real irritated again. But it was a big step for them to go through this process where they were a people pleaser, they were never angry, and now they get angry sometimes, and that's just super scary. And they go through this process where they're learning how to bring anger into their relationships in a way that's appropriate, but it's going to be messy for a while because they don't know how to do it. It's kind of this process. And then eventually they learn how to surrender that more, but still get the information to set the boundary, or to talk about what they need to, or to express their unmet need, and then to get to the place where now it's released, and now they have something that transformative emotions are there. But there's kind of this developmental process, kind of like we see in Christian spiritual formation, right? We don't go from being a babe in Christ to mature, right? We've got all of this mess. And so feels like that's an area for work for us that I think that there's some developmental aspects of this that we don't want to send the meta communication that when we're touching on things, negative affect, for example, that it's just going to automatically in one session with me be released. It may start. There's a process that can happen in this, especially if someone's just developmentally, they've never touched those. So we're too dangerous, too many traumatic memories or neglect or whatever. And so we need to deal with some of that. And there's a lot of anger there that needs to be surrendered to God and healing and everything. And so anyway, just thought I would just bring that up, those 2 points, that
Thank
there's
you.
more on
Well, those are
resolution
golden.
and the
Those are really
developmental
golden,
process, I think,
Fernando.
is where we're headed.
Yeah, thanks so much. I want to, comment on both of them, but I'm only going to make a comment on the second one. Um, what you're suggesting is that there is a kind of implicit developmental map that we have but don't know it, related to our story,
Mm-hmm.
that the emotions are bearing witness to, and that the different negative emotions bear witness to different elements of that story that need, all of which need to be manifested, to be true, to have integrity. And this is why, in part, God gave us this complex negative emotion system that has, depending on how you count it out, at least 6 discrete emotions, and really more than that, more like 20, because each of them has a kind of special meaning that may need to be experienced and expressed and released, maybe eventually, depending. It's all depending, right, on what it is. But you just opened up a whole new category for me in thinking about that the therapy process, and maybe other people have written about this, but I've not read about it, that the therapy process is one of the things it's trying to do is it's unpacking an emotion map. And there are probably different ways that map ideally gets processed.
Yeah.
Maybe the EFT people have worked on that a little bit, but not quite the way you articulated it.
No, I don't. I think they've worked on it some, but I don't think. That whole developmental piece, and like you said, there's different trajectories and things there. So like someone who's angry all the time but can't express vulnerability and sadness and weakness, weaker emotions, that has a whole different trajectory of humility for them, learning how to grow in the virtue of humility and to experience sadness and loss instead of trying to take the constant dominant angry stance, the power and everything. And there's this developmental process, I think, for their healing, for someone in terms of anger management is really, to me, dealing with sadness repression and shame repression. That actually we can manage anger, but we're not going to resolve it until we deal with the emotions they can't express. What are they not expressing? It's sadness, it's vulnerability, it's shame. It's, they want to be dominant all the time and in control and in charge. And it's like, okay, but there's this developmental process for them too. So I think we can think about this in terms of your maps there and trajectories, and think about how Christ and walking with Christ influences those developmental trajectories and the therapeutic process, and normalizing that, like I said. So it's like really scary when I work with a client and they're starting to get in touch with their anger, and they've always kind of been in a spiritual bypass where they felt like it was wrong or bad, and now they're expressing it and they feel really guilty about that, and it's messy. And it's like, and then they're learning how to express it appropriately because it's been developmentally suppressed so long. So it's kind of like they're a 2-year-old again in terms of anger. And then they grow into a 3 and a 4 and a 5. And then they kind of mature in Christ in terms of how they process those things. And same thing with someone who has an anger problem with their sadness, and they learn how to connect with sadness and vulnerable emotions, and to talk with, I'm really feeling uneasy right now, instead of blowing up or causing an argument, and so yeah, just
That's great.
just a thought
Have
on
you
that.
written on this anywhere?
I have not written on that. It's an observation that I'm making. Actually, yeah. I think it's just in terms of
Well,
my own journey and stuff, my own healing journey,
it's really good. I know
where
we're all loving it. And I'm thinking we got to ask you to come and do a webinar on maybe, I don't know, but maybe on that topic would be so fascinating. And we give you an opportunity to kind of collect your thoughts and maybe turn it into an article or something. Because that was pretty cool stuff there to witness and to take in. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, very welcome. Very welcome.
Yeah. All right. Oh, can I, though you did trigger one thought. It was a good thought. It wasn't a bad trigger. But I don't know if any of you have heard of this book, but it just came out by Robert Roberts. He's a philosopher, and those philosophers, they're too hard to read. But this is like Robert Roberts made simple. I don't, yeah, that's not possible, really. But this is the simplest book he's ever written, and he's like in his 80s. And I don't know who encouraged him to do this, but Virtue, Ethics, and Christian Perspective. I thought of him because he talks about emotion more than any other Christian philosopher, more than maybe any other contemporary philosopher, and the intersection of virtue and emotion. And his whole corpus is very difficult. But for those of you who want to be challenged, you might take a look at some of his work. But this is a simpler book that I think any of us could read. It's written for probably college undergrads, and I wanted to mention it because of you were talking about really this, and this is what makes Christian emotion therapy different, so different from secular EFT, is that for us virtues and emotions are very closely aligned. That all virtue flows out of emotion. This is one reason why Roberts dedicated so much of his career to their intersection. So it's not a topic that gets addressed in mainstream psychology, right? One more thought, Whitney. So nice to see you.
Yeah, you too. Thinking in EFT, how it was designed for couples, and I originally, at least, I remember at one point you said, and it stuck with me, at least I think you said this, that the God gave us a marriage relationship as kind of a primary place for healing, or has the capacity to be one of the major places for healing in our lives. So given those things and just thinking of working with couples, have you thought of any way to implement this in couples work, and kind of bring in that primary attachment and Christ's compassion? And yeah.
You're muted, Eric.
Eric, you're mute.
Thank you for that. I was happy to respond to this question, because I do deal with this, and but I have to say I feel really inadequate to respond. I don't know about y'all, but there's a few holes in the whole field, in my opinion. And one of these holes, I just haven't read much addressing this particular problem, but it's the problem of one spouse being ahead of the other developmentally. And I don't know what to do about that. I'm familiar enough with Sue Johnson's model to appreciate what we're trying to do there. I have my own kind of take on it. I certainly, encourage people to think like, this is the crucible. I can't remember who used that metaphor, but marriage is a crucible, within which you can grow. And of course, there's Howard Hendrix's notion of the imago, that we have that gets that was formed in childhood and that gets activated by our spouse. So there's some good stuff that helps us to explain why marriages get stuck. But I haven't been really successful with helping couples equalize where they're at. It feels like one's ahead of the other, and if they get too far ahead, then they want a divorce. And I do believe sometimes divorce is appropriate response to a very troubled spouse, but most of the time not, and that's because the ideal is a crucible. So how do we keep people in the marriage even though one's ahead of the other? I think what I recommend to spouses who are in that role is find a support system outside the marriage, rather than looking to your spouse as your primary support, which is what all of us did until we realized that they couldn't sustain that role in our lives. And of course, there's the horizontal and the vertical. And so God ideally is the bottomless resource. And hopefully the therapist is a resource. And then friends who are similarly and struggling, a support group for women or support group for men in troubled marriages. Um, and and then so as you said, attachment to God, attachment to others, where there's an insecure attachment happening outside the marriage if the marriage can't support it. But of course, we all want it to happen in the marriage. And I don't know if your question was, directed in that way. I want that. I just don't see it very much, as much as I thought I would in human life. But that would be the ideal. And so that's where I think Sue Johnson's model actually can work. Because the problem is what if I'm doing all I hear you, honey, and honey is not reciprocating. It's really hard to stay there for very long if the model has to, if the marriage is the only relational resources that you're focused on in session.
Yeah. And I may not have worded my question well, but any thoughts about how to then bring this model into that couple's scenario in
Thank you.
session?
Gotcha. Yeah. I need to think about that more than I do. I think part of my wiring is I've never taken an MFT course. I'll just be honest. And so I'm theoretically all over systems and dyads, and I really am. I mean, it's pretty big in me, but what I end up doing with most of my marriages is treating them as individuals. Like, so I see them individually, and then I see them as a couple, and then I see the other spouse, and then I see them as a couple. Now, in couples work, I will say this. I should say this. I needed more time than I have to think through the right answer, because I have many times, now that I think about it, we've had a Jesus encounter with both of them, before Jesus, or one of them, and this would be more like individual therapy with the spouse, a witness, we have done that. So we bring Jesus into them as a couple. What do you need to say to them? What would you like to say to them? What would you like to say to Jesus, each of you, and together? And that can be a very powerful holding hands with Jesus, putting his hand on top of theirs. I mean, there's some really beautiful things that do work in couples therapy. I just forgot that I have done that.
Yeah, no problem. It's difficult question, and I haven't seen much in that.
Yeah. You know what's so cool about this conversation? There have been like 3 or 4 articles that could be written out of just the questions that you all asked. That's how exciting it is to be in Christian psychology, because there's a lot of good stuff in mainstream secular psychology, and there's a lot of good theology, but putting it together in vivo, right, in session with a person who needs this particular thing, this is fresh and new. Is still, even though people have been doing it for a few decades. So I think to have integrity, I'm going to have to leave it at that. But thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.
Yes, and I will share the recording to you all once it's processed. Thank you all for being here. Hope to see you again. Okay, stop recording.